Revelation 18. We've been talking about the end since the beginning, and now we're getting to the end of the end. So, a couple weeks ago, we had the last of the 7 vial judgments. And that really takes you to the end of the tribulation period. Then we once again have back-to-back chapters kind of summarizing the judgment on the religious and political systems of the world. Last week was 17, the false religions of the world, and today, chapter 18, we'll talk about the commercial element as we approach the second coming of Jesus. So as we do usually, let's go here to Revelation and read by verse, and we'll begin with the first 3 verses of chapter 18. After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Like I said last week, always seems like the Bible uses terms of immorality when describing the wickedness of man and judgment and the things they're doing wrong and the destruction coming ahead. These first 3 verses here, what does the term Babylon actually mean? In a couple of my commentaries, it actually teaches that this is a literal Babylon, that Babylon will be rebuilt again. One of the ones I was reading was written just after the Gulf War 30 years ago, the first war with Saddam Hussein. And most of you probably know, but if not, Iraq is in where present day where Babylon was. And he was basically thinking, okay, that war's over, and now the process of building up Babylon will begin. Well, of course, it's 30 years later, and nothing like that has happened. I don't believe it's going to be the actual literal city of Babylon. I believe the Left Behind books take that perspective as well, but I just think it's kind of a symbolic reference of, the systems representing the systems of the world. I don't believe it's one city particularly. I think it could represent all the cities of the world that are about to be to face judgment. A representation of the world system. So, and I don't think it's criticizing commerce, and buying and selling things. I mean, those things are necessary to live, but I think it's the indulgence of it and the extortion and the things that people have done over the years. All of the wicked things associated with the centers of commerce since the beginning of the world. And really, it all began at Babel. And I think maybe that's why they use that term Babylon here. It all began at the Tower of Babel. Basically everybody was living in one place several hundred years after the flood. I'm sure the population was starting to grow, and they were, getting unified, and they want to build a tower, and then the Lord confused their language, and they spread out all throughout the earth. But since that point, even though government is ordained by man, it's always seemed like man has had some form of corrupt government, some wicked leader trying to control or dominate the world. So this chapter is saying God is going to judge this world system. Verses 4 to 8. I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. Once again, another reference to the righteous or the people of God, even though the term church isn't used. Just want to throw that out there. This is several times throughout the book. You hear him talking about the people of God. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back, even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuality, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. For this reason, in one day, her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. So, the days of mercy are over. Now it's time for judgment. A judgment that has been promised for years. Now we've reached this time period. We have another reference to the people of God being here, like I said in verse 4. And so the word church isn't used, but it does show there will be people serving him. So the question arises, who is it? Is it the church that never left? Or is it people who became believers during the tribulation period? Whatever the case, this is the latter stages of the 7 years, and there are still people here serving God. As believers, okay, one of the main things of the Christian life is turn the other cheek when persecuted. We have the example of the Lord. I think during his trial, they smacked him in the face, and I always think of that. He just said, paraphrasing, he said, if I said something wrong, tell me so, but if not, why did you strike me? Just a calm response. After they flogged him, crucified him, put him on a cross, what is the first of his 7 sayings? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that's the attitude, he said, what was it, wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. And basically, the Christian believer is supposed to have that attitude of not of revenge, basically to pray for the Lord to take care of you and take care of your problems. But we're coming to the end now. The time of that is about over. It's like this is over. The judgment for my people for centuries is about to end, and I'm about to pour out my wrath on the people who have tormented and persecuted my people all since the beginning of time. I think of the last couple of chapters, it makes reference to this. I wrote down chapter 16, 5 through 6. I heard an angel of the waters say, righteous are you who are and who were, O Holy One, because you judge these things. For they poured out the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it. So all the persecuted throughout the ages, the Lord has not forgotten that, and he is pouring out his wrath as a result of it. Last week in chapter 17, verse 14, these will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. So the days of forgiveness are complete, and now the time for punishment and retribution are coming, but to not the people of God, the people who have persecuted the people of God all throughout the ages. The cup of the Lord's wrath is now full. And this is, of course, described as the political system of the world, people who are in charge running things and who bring these things about. Verses 9 and 10. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. It's the second time they use the term 1 hour. Woe, woe, when I hear that, remember back in the book, first we have the first woe was passed, the second woe, and then the third woe. This is kind of like another play on that word, woe, woe. This is the second reference to kings of the earth. And when we're thinking about the timeline, if you want to go back briefly to way back in Revelation 6, when the 7 seals are introduced, the 6th one, it says, verse 15, then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. So although that's way back in Revelation 6, it sounds like the events that are happening there are basically similar to the events that are happening here, which makes me reemphasize the point that this story of Revelation is it'll go forward, then it'll go back, go forward and go back, and maybe just focus on an event coming to a climax. We also had references to the kings last week in chapter 17 when it was talking about Babylon, with whom the kings of earth committed the acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. So this doesn't mean the king was actually being immoral with a female called Babylon. This is just symbolic reference of the Lord's, it's a language he uses to describe rebellion and disobedience. The best example he gives is immorality. We know power corrupts, and this verse sums up the judgment. Because of man's fallen nature, it's just hard when a person is in leadership. It just seems like, it gets the best of them, and it can bring out their worst. Very rarely will a person, lead and be flawless, because there's just so many things that come with it. And unless you're filled with the Spirit of God, it's hard to not let those things happen. I'll use an example. I'm a fan of our president, big time. I don't know if he's a Christian or not. Some are saying he's got a lot of people with him. I believe he's a work in process.
Yes.
And I remember, I don't want to get too much off the subject, about 7 or 8 years ago, someone played a prophecy. This man was proclaiming the next president of the United States, said he will not be a Christian when he goes in, he will be when he comes out. Well, the first thing I thought of, everybody thought Hillary was going to be the next president then. So he didn't say she. And the further I hear that prophecy, I'm thinking hopefully that comes to pass. But my point being, he's had a lot of scandal, false charges. Basically, the whole term he's had to fight against things. But I also thought he's a very, big ego. He's a, bragging person, and maybe he needed those things to keep him. You're supposed to think everybody loved him. Maybe no one could take Donald Trump if he had no opposition at all. So sometimes perhaps the Lord allows things like that. But just an example, when you have power, it's hard not to use it, and even use it, wrongly, if you have the ability to do that. And some people are not too bad, and then we have horrible leaders throughout the ages, like Hitler and Stalin, like that, who absolutely do terrible things. So this is all part of this world system that's going to be judged. And these last chapters seem to be listing one by one how the Lord's wiping them out, one thing after the other. And I just said I don't believe this is actually one city, but instead I think it's a representation of all the commercial cities and elements of the world. When 9/11 just hit, when I was going to school at Regent, and one of the professors there said he was driving through New York when this was just after the towers went down. Said he was driving through New York years back, even then, and he wasn't talking about what had just happened. He said the Lord just gave him the strongest vision that this whole entire city was just wiped out. He said it was so real. He said he almost had to pull the car over and throw up. It was just such a devastating view of what the eventual outcome of New York City is. Now that wasn't talking about 9/11. That was like a precursor, and even not today, but it's almost like you can almost see that happen now. They were saying back in March and April, showing pictures of Times Square, and it looked like Chrisfield on a Saturday night in January. New York City, it was like devastation had hit the place, and now it's just slowly, gradually coming back to life. I believe New York will be judged here, and many other nations. You think of San Francisco and Los Angeles and Hollywood with their immorality. And these all are coastal cities, but I also believe it will be, nations of the world, who've been, participated in the world system and have persecuted the people of God all throughout the ages. Going to read a large segment here, 11 through 20, the next 10 verses. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Now it begins a list, all the things, that are associated with commerce. Cargoes of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet, and every kind of citron wood, and every article of ivory, and every article made from very costly wood and bronze, iron, and marble. Just a quick note when I add here, just when you hear of all this prosperity, it just reminds you of Solomon's temple when it first built. It seemed like he had everything in the world that came in there. Just made a little reference to that. Verse 13, and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil and fine flour and wheat, cattle, sheep, and cargoes of horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. We think of all the past history of slavery, even existed today. But today I think of human trafficking, which is a major problem. And when you think of this, you don't think of it headquarters being in some backcountry town. You think of the big cities. If you want to participate in this or be a part of it, that's where it would occur, in the back streets of major cities. The fruit you long for has gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, and saying, once again we have this term, verse 16, woe, woe, the great city, and who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. Again the term 1 hour is used. And every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, and as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance. It seems like most major cities are on like a major waterfront, and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she hath been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven. And it concludes what the saying of heaven. The first 9 verses I read there were all describing all the horrible things that was happening. And what does they say here? Rejoice over her, O heavens, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. So all the cries of the Lord are finally being heard, and he is judging them, which makes me again not think it's one city, just like the entire world, but in centers of commerce. We have a thorough description of the complete devastation of things of this world that the world would describe as valuable. Things that people put hope in their trust in. People who place their hope in these things can do nothing but weep because they're no more. They're literally watching them being destroyed in front of them. It begins, the list that I just read begins with like precious stones, but it goes through all things that are considered value of this world, but now basically becoming worthless. Suppose you thought the world was about to be destroyed in the next few hours. What would anything, even the most valuable thing you own, what would that be of value to you at that point? Quite vivid description is listed here. And made me think of something too. I remember several years ago when my father was dying, the hospice gave out a little notebook, and it described the events, what happens to people in the final stages. And one of the things it listed was gradual loss of interest in basically anything. And I saw that in Dad's life thing. He just enjoyed things, or he enjoyed watching comedy TV shows and baseball games. It was just no interest at all. And not just necessarily a dying person, older people that I know, the older they get, you'll tell them something, and they're just not really interested anymore. I think it's just a basically thing that after all these years they realize that, the futile or the vanities of life, all these temporary things around us are just passing away. Just for them, they know for certain it's going to be sooner than others. Of course, you don't have to be old to die in that sense. But it's just something built into us that we finally realize, all these things that we thought were so important, they weren't that big a deal to begin with. So that kind of is one of the thought I have is as these people are watching the city being destroyed, it's like it doesn't matter anymore. Those things I put so much value in, what's the point of it? this is a view that believers, we should have the things of this world to begin with. As we read these passages of Scripture, we know everything we have, we just have temporarily. So let me pose that question to you. What would you do if you were living then? And then all your possessions would become, worthless to you. I'm guilty as the next person. I have some things that I've accumulated over years that I really like. But as I get older, I try to ask the Lord, Lord, help me to enjoy them, but make them to the point of, if I lost them, it wouldn't devastate me. Yeah. And I can't say I'm at that point now. There's some things, if something happened to me, that would be very hurtful. But that's a goal for all of us to have, because we know the eventual outcome, eventually what's going to happen to them. So all over the world this is occurring. Things that are will be called valuable have been laid waste and are nothing. Now, several times in this chapter it uses the term 1 hour. My initial thought was that's kind of just like a symbolic reference to very rapidly, but it occurs 3 or 4 times in this chapter, and it may actually literally be the case just in 1 hour. The Lord will wipe things out, and using complete devastation. And we'd also think back to the judgments, which I'll get to that in a moment. So he's completely wiped out the religious system in last chapter. He's completely wiped out the world's political system in this chapter. And let's see how 18 closes out. Then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. This is verse 21. Saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. And the sound of the harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in your city any longer, not city, you any longer, and no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer, and the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer. So this is kind of like symbolic references of all the things that go on in the great cities. And the light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard in you any longer. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. When I read these last section of verses of chapter 18, the first thing I think of when it says a giant stone is thrown into the sea, once again, let's go back, Revelation 8. Earlier we talked about the seals, now to talk about the trumpets. Revelation 8, chapter 8, verse 8. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. Then it goes on to say the next one in verse 10, the third angel sounded, a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers. So that would kind of go again with the theme that even though this happened way back in 8, it might be describing events that are all occurring here at the end right now. So you've got at the end of the trumpet seals, you have judgment of things being, and this seems to just describe something physically happened to all the great commerce centers of the earth. Is it a giant meteor that will hit our earth? Is that the way the Lord will use it? Or will he just do something supernatural? Whatever the case, judgment is coming. Whatever the case, I can't help but think about the unprecedented events of this year, 2020. It just makes you think how everything all of a sudden is looked at differently. I thought of an illustration. I don't think I've used this in the class. I hope I haven't, because it really stuck me. The last few Sundays, whenever, like today I won't because the weather's bad, I've been going through old graveyards and looking at dates. And the oldest one I found is right by St. Peter's Church. His name was John Williams. He was born in 1701 and he died in 1787. So, well, first of all, he lived 86 years, which was very good back then. And I was just thinking the world. First of all, he wasn't born in the United States, Maryland. He was born in Maryland, a British colony. There was no United States then. It was not a United States, so he was an old man. He died the year the Constitution was ratified, and a couple years before our first president, George Washington. So I said, what would that guy do if he came up, and saw this world? He'd look around, see things in a car would go by, and then he's saying, what is that thing, and where's the horse pulling that thing? And then he'd go into town and just see a modern world. Then we'd say, sir, and this is Chrisfield, we're 20, 30 years behind most of the world. You ain't seen nothing as you go out that road the farther you go. But then another thought occurred to me. Suppose John Smith died last year, say he's 70-year-old or whatever, died in 2019, and he came back this year, just 1 year later. He will go and look and see, why is people walking around with masks? Why is grocery stores boarded up, like a terrorist is going to attack the place? Why are there little red dots telling me where to stand? So that's just all that could happen in 1 year. The view of the world is hopefully, well, first of all, they want to say how bad it is. Second of all, in their mind, 2 to 3 years from now, it's completely gone. And say 5 years from now, somebody walks in with a mask as a joke, say, oh, I remember that, and I'm going to go back to that again. Or years from now, a little kid will see a picture and say, why are all these people walking around with masks? That's what the world's view of this is. It's horrible. They want to say how bad it is now, but in their mind, they just want to get past this. Will we get past it? Will everything ever be the same again? And it makes me wonder. I don't think they will be. But just a retrospect how things have changed all of a sudden. I think of how the Lord is going to begin to judge things, and I think He already has. I think of sports. I grew up loving sports ever since a kid. Over the years, my interest has diminished, and even before all this, but now I've almost lost complete interest. I watch it occasionally. I watched a little bit of the World Series last night, but I have no interest at all. And it seems like it's like judgment has come. When you think of the merchants being described here, you definitely think of the athletic world because they make so much money. And not just the players, the owners as well, but I mean just ridiculous amounts. Pitchers will pitch one game and make more than the average person makes in a year. And then also not just the athletic industry, entertainment industry. Less movies this year. Movie theaters are becoming a thing of the past because of that. Television shows are being delayed, and our society has a short attention span. You don't produce something regularly, people will lose interest and move on, and it just seems this is like the early phases of the Lord judging these things that maybe in themselves are not wrong, nothing wrong with entertainment, but when they get to a point where the people that participate in them are observed as gods, the Lord is judging that, and I believe that's what's happening here as we close out this chapter 18. Now I wanted to summarize this week. After today, there's 4 chapters left, and my theme has always been that Revelation is not straight chronological, but the last 4 chapters pretty much are. We have the second coming, the 1,000 years, the New Jerusalem, and then eternity. So what I thought I'd do at the end of this chapter is kind of summarize Revelation 1 through 18, just very briefly, how we've kind of gone back and forth and back and forth. What I'll do, I'm trying to write down, bringing up to this point. Let's write a big Revelation here, and then I'll put the chapter. So first chapter, we just had the intro, the Lord revealing Himself to John, who was His apostle. 2 and 3, we had the churches and His message to each of them. And basically I taught from the view that they were kind of representation of the churches all throughout time. Then we have chapter 4 and 5, heavenly worship. Kind of the first of several scenes in heaven. Now as we get into chapter 6, we begin to see events that are going to unfold on the earth. The first of 3 sets of judgments begin here. We have the beginning of the 7 seals, although it only lists 6 of them. through 6. So this makes you look, this is kind of like the beginning of either the last 7 years or the last 3.5 years. And then in Revelation 7, we have the first of 3 interludes. That's where it stops a second and talks about something else. Interlude 1. Revelation 8 and 9. We have the 7th seal, so we have the 1/6 here, and the 7th seal introduces the trumpet judgments. So this seems to be going in a fairly parallel line, getting towards the end. So we got the trumpets, and then the judgment of the trumpets, things are getting worse. Chapter 10, another interlude. Remember when we talked about John ate the book and it was sweet in his mouth and bitter in his belly? This is kind of a little symbolic thing going on here. It takes a break from the events of Revelation to describe, we'll call that interlude number 2. That was chapter 10. Chapter 11, 2 witnesses. Remember we discussed, who will they be? Will they be Elijah, Enoch, Moses?
Yes, I think so.
And this is a period of 3.5 years, so this is kind of covering from the beginning to the end, so it's going back and forth, not like a straight read. Chapter 12, a lot of symbolism in 12. That's the red dragon, the woman with the 12 stars. Kind of symbolic description of the battle of the ages. We'll do 12 stars. And this is kind of taking a break from actually what's happening, describing the whole summary of good versus evil. Chapter 13, rise of the Antichrist and false prophet. So we're all the way into Revelation. They really don't get introduced to the second half. So it makes you feel that it's just telling one big story of all the things that are going on at one time with general progression. Chapter 14, our third interlude. Interlude number 3. Once again, it takes a break from the things on earth. And this one is the second of 2 references to the 144,000. We'll put third interlude, 144K, number 2. And where was the first one? I missed that. Chapter 7 was the first reference to the 144,000. So the theme's being repeated all throughout the book. Chapter 15, one more final vision in heaven. In our early visions of heaven, the saints were not there. When we get here, the saints do seem to be there, so this might be wrapping up after it's all over with, once again showing that it's not straight chronologically. Vision in heaven. As we progress. Now chapter 16. 7 last vials, we did that 2 weeks ago. The most intense judgment, maybe the shortest in duration. So you have the seals, and remember our theory, instead of seals, trumpets, vials, seals, trumpets, vials, so they're all coming together at the end. Last week, 17, religious Babylon, we'll call it. So the 7 vials take us to the end, but then we back up again, where it takes a minute to describe what's going to happen to the religious systems of the world, and then at the same time the commercial system of the world, which we talked about this week, commercial Babylon, we'll call it. So what I wanted to point to, that even though the book is heading in a general direction, it's not a straight, beginning of the 7 years starts in Revelation 1, and the end of the 7 years starts in chapter 19 with the second coming. It's a gradual description of events, a break every now and then, scenes in heaven. The judgments, although separate judgments, seem to merge together at the end, pouring out its wrath, and all accumulating to a place where they're going to happen. So from this perspective, from this preterist, or not preterist, futuristic perspective that we're teaching, here's what I believe is going to happen. These judgments have fallen. The Lord has poured out His wrath on the religious systems of this world, on the commercial systems of this world. Billions, not millions, billions have died. What is left of this world system will seem to turn their attention to Jerusalem for the final battle, and then the long promise, the millennial 2,000-year promise of the Lord's return will happen, and that's what we'll discuss as we go into next week, the return of Christ. So that's what I want to end it with today. I wanted to wrap it up just basically to show you where we've been and how it's been kind of like a back and forth, but from now on it's going to, the last 4 chapters will basically say how history will unfold, and we'll eventually get to a point that no matter your view of the book of Revelation, we'll all agree as we get to eternity that in the end, the Lord's people will reign forever in peace. Any thoughts as we close this out today? Questions? Comments? Lord, we thank you for this lesson today. Help us to continue to study your word, read about the events that will unfold, but always keeping in mind that there are people around us who do not know you, and help us be aware of them, be a witness to them, and help lead them to the Lord. So whenever you come or whenever you call, we'll be ready to meet you. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.